Hey, everybody, it's Tommy Canelli, and welcome back to Before the Lights podcast, the show that tells you how they made their mark. He has a career as a law enforcement officer with family roots that go back to the 19th century. The author of 4 books that includes his new title, Mafia Dreams, a true crime saga of young men at the end of an era in Kansas City. He enjoys being the last man to be officially inducted into the Sabenadica Club. Please welcome to the show, Frank Hayde. Frank, welcome to Before the Lights.
Thank you, Tommy. I'm glad to be here.
Excited. We're going to get into your book. But before we do, I want to kind of give my listeners just a short background of maybe who you are and where you come from, because your family is Irish-American bricklayers and machine politicians. What's that mean to you?
Yeah, so my family goes back a long way in Kansas City, and I grew up hearing a lot of stories about the old days. The Haydes were Irish immigrants. They came over, they landed in Kansas City. They were bricklayers by trade. They built some notable buildings in Kansas City that still stand to this day. That's the outstanding brickwork, doesn't have a crack in it. But they were also involved in machine politics in Kansas City, and machine politics are a big part of my first book, which was called Mafia and the Machine, the story of the Kansas City mob. And the machine refers to the political machine within the Democratic Party that really controlled a lot of American cities in the early part of the 20th century. These machines were typically made up of Irish-American Democrats. There's some exception to that. But my ancestors were part of that in Kansas City. And then later on, I started writing about some of these stories and events that had always intrigued me throughout my young life. And that's what brought me up to the point where we are today, which is my latest book, Mafia Dreams.
I said that you're happy to be in the Sabenadica Club, but I'm positive my listeners are going, the what club? So I want to take a second and just kind of let you explain what that club is. My understanding is it's about civic pride and spreading love. Is that true?
That is true. The Sabenadica Club was a club that was started at Italian Gardens restaurant in Kansas City back in the early part of the 20th century. And you had to have a membership in the Sabenadica Club, which Sabenadica is Italian for, or maybe more specifically Sicilian for God be with you. That's what it translates to. Sabenadica. And so if you had a membership in the Sabenadica Club, then you got to sit at the Sabenadica table.
Gotcha.
At the Italian Gardens restaurant, which was a landmark restaurant in Kansas City. It was a huge, enormous restaurant. And it was a microcosm of city life. And it was also a stopover spot for the traveling public, including celebrities and athletes and well-known opera singers, you name it. It was well-known all over the country and even all over the world. Back then, Kansas City was the midway point on the coast-to-coast journey by rail. And so everybody was always stopping in Kansas City, getting off the train and maybe spending a night there, maybe spending a couple of nights. And it was a real center of jazz music at the time. And it was known as a place where big things happened. And at the center of that was Italian Gardens. And at the center of Italian Gardens was the Sabenadica table. So my ancestors were part of that club way back in the 20s and the 30s. And then I got inducted posthumously, I guess you could say, this century, even after the restaurant had finally closed, when I worked with the family that ran that restaurant for generations, write a book about their story. And that was called Italian Gardens, A History of Kansas City Through Its Favorite Restaurant. So as you can see, I'm pretty into KC history.
Yes.
But also the organized crime.
I looked up that book, Italian Gardens, and it looks like it's pretty difficult to get your hands on a copy of it these days.
Yeah, it was a self-published effort and pretty niche market there. So I think it is out of print. I think the DeCapos have a box or two stashed away that they're slowly trickle out to their friends and associates. But it's a great book if you like city life and interesting people, colorful characters, etc.
Let's get into your new book, Mafia Dreams. This is a great story, listeners. You go to the show notes. I'm going to put a link to where you can buy the book directly so you can read this. It's a true crime saga, like I said, of young men at the end of an era in Kansas City that takes place after Operation Straw Man, which was basically the Las Vegas Skim. And for those who've listened to my show long enough, are pretty familiar with that. And there was a group of people called the Young Italians. And before we get into that and some the precursor to the Young Italians, Frank, can you give us just briefly, what was the age range of these guys that were labeled the Young Italians?
Well, these days they're in their mid-50s, early to mid-50s, like me. Back then they were in their early to mid-20s. And so the story takes place in the 1990s, which, the story of the Kansas City Mafia every treatment of it up to this point has sort of ended after Straw Man. So it ends in the 80s because that really was the end of an era. And things were never the same in Kansas City or a lot of other places after the Straw Man, Las Vegas casino skimming investigations and convictions. But it did not end organized crime in Kansas City. Things were still happening, and there was at the time still a generation of young guys who were still trying to break into that life. And that's kind of what this story is about. It's about young men at the end of an era, young men who were maybe born too late.
Yeah, exactly.
Guys who sort of straddled the centuries and bet on the past.
Before we get into Ferrell Travis Riley, so we can bring that up to speed, how bad did the police department and the FBI want these young guys? Were they really after these young guys? Were they really trying to get to who we're going to talk about, which is Travis Riley?
Yeah, the FBI and the local law enforcement also really did have a long-standing interest in ending organized crime in Kansas City. And they had been at it for years. And back in the 70s, they suffered a lot of embarrassment with their inability to solve murders, inability to bring a lot of these guys to justice. So that just made them even more adamant about trying to win that war, I guess you could say. And in the 80s with Straw Man and Las Vegas, etc., they really did strike a crippling blow against the Mafia in Kansas City and beyond. But again, it was so entrenched in Kansas City, and it was so much a part of city life in that town. The organization was so strong that even Straw Man couldn't put an end to it. And these young guys represented the next generation. And they were also known to be hot-headed and violent. And so, yes, I believe that the FBI wanted these guys really bad.
Let's explain of who Ferrell Travis Riley, who he was. He was somebody who stayed on the move. He was always ahead of law enforcement. This guy made millions by fraud in several states. But what else can you tell us about who he was?
So Ferrell Travis Riley, he kind of came into Kansas City out of left field, along with his whole family, which a former assistant U.S. attorney described as a crime family unto themselves. That would be the Riley family. Ferrell Travis Riley was the patriarch. He came out of rural Texas. He was a country boy from rural backwoods of eastern Texas. And somewhere along the way, he morphed into a very sophisticated insurance fraud. And he ran this insurance racket, really started in Texas, and it spread to many, many states. He would basically run from state to state, sort of like the outlaws from the Old West used to do. But in this case, it was white collar crime. And when regulators or law enforcement caught up with him one state, he was on to the next. And he had quite the scam going. It was international in scope. He was on the radar of the U.S. Congress and the FBI and the IRS and state legislatures in probably a dozen different states. He landed in Kansas City with his family, including his youngest son, Joe Riley, who was a wannabe gangster. That's sort of the nexus here between this collision of international sophisticated white-collar crime and the gritty underworld of a mafia town.
From the research I've done, did you see this Kansas City mansion that they keep talking about that Travis Riley had?
I've seen it from the outside. I've never been inside. Heard a lot of stories from people who used to attend the big parties that the Rileys would host there. Rileys, I think, were trying to get in good with the Italian community, get in good with the certain elements of organized crime in Kansas City. And so they hosted a lot of parties at this mega mansion that they had. And a lot of people started wondering, hey, who are these guys? And, like one of the FBI agents I interviewed said that the LCN, the La Cosa Nostra, they like criminals who know how to make a lot of money. And that's exactly what Travis Riley was. And Joe Riley, as the youngest son of Travis Riley, was able to sort of ingratiate himself with some men that he otherwise would have never been able to, I don't think, including some of the one of the top gangsters in Kansas City.
For Travis, then, from reading the book, was it Susan Coon or was it Cheryl, his wife, that benefited him the most?
Right. Cheryl Coon was Travis Riley's wife. Coon was her maiden name. She did later change it to Riley. But she was really, I don't think he could have done all this without her. Travis could barely even read and write. Now, that's not to say he wasn't a smart guy. He was. But his wife had a lot of sophistication in knowing how to run a business, how to crunch numbers, how to be savvy financially. I believe she had an MBA. And so together, they were able to really elevate this insurance fraud into a real juggernaut of corruption, which, again, was, international in scope. Yeah. So, again, I know this to listeners, it probably sounds a little confusing and all. And it is pretty intricate, a lot of very intricate white-collar crime. It's all laid out in the book, Mafia Dreams. And I think it's really, if you get your hands on the book, it'll all kind of gel and the pieces will fit together. It is a pretty intriguing story. And it's not just Kansas City. Includes other places like Las Vegas even.
Right.
Definitely some material that I think would be of interest to folks in Las Vegas for sure.
Listeners, let me kind of give you just a quick synopsis on Travis and Cheryl, because they were eventually hit with numerous charges and indictments. They got charged under the RICO Act, 16 counts of racketeering, insurance fraud, bribery, money laundering, tax evasion. It was a 53-page indictment with an estimated gross receipts at $28 million. So that kind of gives you an idea of how much money these two were scamming all over the world. I mean, as you said, they'd go from one place to another, but eventually caught up to them. The one story in the Travis Riley thing before we move forward into Joe and Michael Albanese and these guys is this, and this kind of, I think will help bring the listeners together with it, is he had swindled so many people out of so much money, but then there was a couple guys in Kevin Hare and Raymond Searman who were trying to swindle Travis into a double deal.
Yeah.
Because, they had kind of gotten taken. But then, if I understand right, Kevin Hare, he becomes an informant. He goes to rehab. He flees. He then becomes arrested. And then doesn't he get charged as well?
Well, Tommy, I have to honestly thank you for, reading this book, obviously, and paying close attention to it. That's really impressive. Yeah, Travis had some close associates. He had his family, his four sons and his wife and various stepkids and other close family associates. But he also had these non-family associates that kind of made up what I guess you could call the Riley crime family or the Riley crime enterprise. And one of those individuals you mentioned, Kevin Hare, he was a lawyer and represented Travis Riley and got him off of some pretty serious RICO charges down in Texas. And they became pretty close friends and associates. But then Kevin Hare and his pal Roger Sermon, they saw an opportunity to swindle Travis Riley, and they set up a whole big bribery scheme where they pretended to be the Missouri Commissioner of Insurance. They had got one of their friends to pretend to be the commissioner, and they made Travis think that the commissioner was trading favors for bribe money, and so Travis wired all this money into various accounts, and Hare and Sermon just stole all of it. What was Travis Riley going to do, right?
Right.
Run to the law?
Right.
No. So they thought they had quite the scam going, but the FBI did find out about it, and they pressured Kevin Hare to become an informant against Travis Riley. But Travis Riley also had another close associate who turned informant against him. That was Jim Whining, who was later represented by Oscar Goodman. And Jim Whining really helped bring Travis Riley down, I guess you'd say, by working as an informant. Yes, sir.
So Travis is convicted on 10 counts and gets a 9-year sentence. Cheryl's convicted on 9 counts and gets a 7-year sentence. And we talked about his son, Joe, who was a wannabe gangster. And listeners, the reason I want to do a little bit detailed background on Travis is Joe is a kid that wants to be a gangster who's not Italian, that pretends he's Italian. He's hanging out with this group, the Young Italians. But the reason I asked the question earlier, if the police department really wanted these guys, is I was thinking that maybe they were looking to get Joe, the son, because of all the hidden assets that Travis had somewhere. So I figured if they nailed Joe, they could get to the assets.
Yeah, and that's a prominent theory out there amongst Joe's friends and amongst the Riley family and beyond, that the FBI baited Joe into a trap in order to arrest him and then squeeze him for information on Travis Riley's hidden assets, because Travis Riley had tens of millions of dollars invested in assets, fine art, automobiles, all kinds of luxury goods. And, he was ordered to pay a lot of money in restitution, but they couldn't get him to cough up any cash because it was all depleted. They knew he had his assets somewhere, and they wanted those assets. Where they were, nobody really knew. Joe knew, so the FBI went after Joe. That's a theory. Now, I interviewed the lead agent on this case, Agent Ron Halter. He denies that assets were the main objective in what later became this reverse drugs thing that the story kind of centers around. Mm-hmm. But either way, yes, the FBI was using Joe to get to Travis Riley. That is clear. That is not disputed. Travis Riley was already in prison. Actually, he was awaiting sentencing at the time. But they continued their insurance rackets. They continued this elaborate criminal enterprise that they had going as they were awaiting sentence after they had been convicted. And so Joe became I think the FBI saw him as the weak link. And so by going after Joe, they hoped to finally put an end once and for all to the Travis Riley insurance fraud enterprise.
Did they ever find the assets?
Never did. Aside from one or two stray items, they were pretty small consequence, but no, never did.
Frank, how big of a player was Joe?
That's an interesting question. And I think it's one of the fascinating elements of the book. Really hard to tell. It is really hard to tell if Joe Riley was a wannabe, a young kid who wasn't even Italian, but he desperately wanted to be, and he dressed in silk suits, tailored suits, and sunglasses and slick back hair and big cigars. That's how this 19-year-old kid would walk around the city, And he hung out with the older people in the older neighborhoods. he really wanted to be a gangster. And a lot of people thought he was kind of a joke, that this was kind of cute and funny and hilarious. This rich kid who was playing like he was a gangster. But as events transpired, we will see, without giving too many spoilers out there, that Joe was in fact able to, by many accounts, including the FBI, become a bona fide associate of the Kansas City Mafia. And we'll see later on, too, that he was not afraid to take that plunge into the underworld and literally pull the trigger. Later on, we're going to see Joe walking into a hotel room and pulling out a gun, and without hesitation, and almost like a professional hitman, aiming in and squeezing off 3 rounds at his target. Mm-hmm. So it's a kind of interesting dichotomy there. Got this young kid with no criminal record and spoiled brat in a way from a rich family. Ill-gotten rich, but they were rich. So was he a wannabe or was he the real deal? Well, I think the answer is he was both.
Michael Albanese, carjacking, marijuana ring. How big of a player was he, and how close was Michael and Joe Riley?
Albanese is a very interesting character, very interesting subject in this story. Born in Brooklyn to a wise guy father, ends up in Kansas City, living in a poor neighborhood, gets in with the young Italians, and proves to be kind of the quintessential young Italian. He's a fairly hardcore criminal. He's involved in auto theft from the time he's a juvenile, and he gets into pretty sophisticated cocaine sales, and he has a temper, and he is known to not hesitate to use violence. And he and Joe become good friends. And this is exactly the kind of guy that Joe really wants to meet. It's exactly the kind of guy that Joe wants to be around, exactly the kind of guy that Joe wants to impress. And that's a little background on Mike Albanese.
How big was this drug ring that the young Italians had going? Because it was linked to the Cali Cartel and to the Kansas City mob. But
well, it was sizable for sure, no doubt about it. It was kind of a cooperative collaboration between the young Italians, who were at least implicitly backed by the Kansas City Mafia, and certainly some of the young Italians that had fathers and uncles who were made guys in the outfit, and so they had that gravitas that allowed them to work with the Cali Cartel out of Colombia. And so you had 2 very powerful criminal organizations coming together to import cocaine into Kansas City. And some of these young Italians started making big money real quick. And it was fun while it lasted, but it didn't last that long. Law enforcement developed informants in the case, and this international conspiracy was eventually taken down, and convictions of some of the Colombians and some of the young Italians, many of the young Italians at that time. Albanese was not part of that, but Nick Lanfranca was, and Nick Lanfranca is an important player in this story also, along with Michael Albanese and Joe Riley. Those 3 young men kind of make up the core element of the story. It's what happened to those 3 that really makes the story what it is.
We had both mentioned they were after Joe Riley because of his father. But then enter in Joe Bartels, who's the next door neighbor to Joe Riley, that I think changed the investigation. He's an informant. So my question is, was he placed there by the FBI?
Yeah, that's a controversial one. And again, I want to commend you and thank you for your thorough attention to this story. Um, so Joe Bartels was a career criminal who was also an informant for local law enforcement and for the FBI. And agents discovered one day that he was coincidentally and fortuitously living right next door to the Rileys. Now, that's the FBI version. And, Michael Albanese and other people believe that that was just a little too cute, and that Bartels was actually placed there next door to the Riley family by the FBI. So it depends which version you believe. Equal treatment in the book. Tried to remain neutral and interviewed a lot of sources from law enforcement. Also interviewed a lot of from the defense side of the table. But regardless, Joe Bartels turned out to be a very valuable asset for the FBI. Mm-hmm. He was a legitimate criminal, and he was great at bringing out the criminal in other people. And he coincidentally met Joe Riley down at Italian Gardens. That was a setup, and let it slip that he was involved in certain criminal activities. And so that attracted Joe Riley. Joe Riley loved criminals, and he loved criminal activity. And so he glommed on to Joe Bartels, and then the FBI used Bartels to get all kinds of information on wiretaps, body wires, phone recordings, about Joe Riley. So Bartels was a very productive, paid, and well-paid informant. Just the kind of guy that Oscar Goodman loved to hate.
I know he was wired up and stuff, but was the Italian Gardens bugged as well?
Well, no, the Italian Gardens was not bugged, but Bartels did walk in there and sit down at the Sabenadica table while wearing a wire.
Okay.
And yeah, so that generated what became known as the Italian Gardens tapes. And that's when the FBI discovered how close Joe Riley had become to a man named Jimmy Duarte, who was one of the real old school gangsters still operating in Kansas City in the 1990s.
So Joe Riley meets Jimmy Duarte at the Italian Gardens, and they kind of start bonding there because Joe's looking to connect to anybody who's a mobster.
Yeah, absolutely. And for him to connect with Jimmy Duarte would have been, that was like hitting the jackpot for Joe Riley, because Duarte went way back. He was in his mid 70s at this point. But he went way back, and his uncle was in it before he was. And Duarte was a heavy hitter, very colorful character, great big guy with a big booming voice, kind of right out of central casting for a mobster. And like a lot of mobsters, Jimmy Duarte was attracted to, the guys who knew how to make money. And he saw the mansion. He was in the mansion, and he knew all about Travis Riley, and he saw the fine art, the luxury furnishings, and the Mercedes Benzes, and all these things. And I think that he was kind of open minded to developing a relationship with this young kid. Furthermore, Joe Riley, he was pretty good at listen up to guys. He was good at showing respect. He apparently paid tribute to Jimmy Duarte in the form of money and merchandise. And, he was the kind of guy that knew how to say the right things, to flatter these guys and to really kind of get in their good graces.
Listeners, you got to get your hands on Mafia Dreams. There's going to be a link in the show notes. And if you're not really sure if you want to buy it yet, you will now, because on January 30th of 1977, there's a reverse sting to buy cocaine that ends up in Joe Riley being shot to death by an FBI officer. You heard that right. But first, Joe Riley shoots Joe Bartels twice, and I think he fired 3 rounds at him, and he survives at the Motel 6. And to make it a little bit more crazy, Michael Albanese is charged with felony murder of Joe Riley, but he was sitting in the car outside. I mean, that alone, you got to buy the book. I'm telling you.
Well, and just one quick correct, little slip of the tongue. You said 1977, so this was 1997.
Oh, 97.
And yeah, so the FBI, again, to go ahead with their plan to try to arrest Joe Riley, they set up a reverse drug sting. Pretty controversial operations, pretty dangerous operations. Not something the FBI does every day. You know, a drug sting is where the FBI or the law enforcement agency would purchase drugs, you know, from the target. In this case, they're selling drugs to the target. So they got Bartels to check into the Motel 6 with 5 kilos of cocaine that he supposedly brought back from Chicago. And Joe Riley was going to show up at that Motel 6 and purchase that cocaine. The FBI agents in the adjoining room. Video monitoring was set up in the motel room. Joe Riley, Mike Albanese, and Nick Lanfranca drove around Kansas City prior to arriving at the Motel 6, made a bunch of different stops, et cetera. Their every move was being watched. They showed, even by airplane, they showed up at the Motel 6. Joe Riley went in to the Motel 6. But rather than pulling out cash to buy the cocaine, he pulled out a revolver and he shot Joe Bartels twice. And he was aiming in for his third shot when the FBI broke in from the adjoining room and shot and killed Joe Riley. Bartels survived. Riley did not. Kind of a big deal, you know, the FBI, you know, for the FBI to shoot and kill somebody is a pretty big deal. This is not local law enforcement. You know, this is not KCPD or NYPD. You know, it's pretty rare for an agent to even draw their weapon, let alone shoot and kill somebody. But you're right, Tommy, it takes an interesting twist when Michael Albanese, who's out in the car, is charged with the murder of Joe Riley. So you might say to yourself, well, wait a minute, Joe Riley was killed by the FBI. How can they charge Michael Albanese, who's out in the car, with the murder of his friend? That gets into the felony murder rule, which is an interesting legal doctrine. And state of Missouri happens to have one of the harshest applications of felony murder. Michael Albanese was sentenced to life in prison, and he ended up serving 25 and a half years in state prison, and was just released less than a year ago. So Mike is back in Kansas City. He helped out a lot with this story. I'm very grateful for his assistance. Really couldn't have done it without him. His book is full of quotes from Albanese, and served an awful. He'd been, spent the prime years of his life in state prison for what went down at the Motel 6 that night.
Did Joe Bartels then end up in the witness protection program?
He did end up in the witness protection program. I did try to track him down. I was not able to. Nobody in the law enforcement or in the U.S. Attorney's office was willing to share his location, and I don't blame them. Yep. Not that I really think he would truly be in danger still today after all these years. These officers they take an oath, and I only really asked the question as a formality. I already knew the answer before I even asked it, that I wasn't going to find out where he was. He might not be in the program anymore, but his location, I don't know.
How dangerous did the police department or FBI think Joe Riley was? Did they think he was capable of doing this?
Well, and again, it's an interesting question. Just like Riley's friends and associates and customers down at Italian Gardens where he ended up working, there was a lot of uncertainty about it. Is this guy Oak? Is he a ridiculous young wannabe, or is he the real deal? Mm-hmm. And that was something that they discussed before this reverse sting. Hey, is this dangerous? Are we putting our informant's life in danger with this Joe Riley character? And finally, they decided that no, they were not. That Joe Riley had definitely shown himself to be a criminal, but they did not believe that Joe Riley would come in and harm Joe Bartels, who at this point was a good friend of Joe Riley. They had become close friends. So FBI did not believe that would happen, and yet it did. And that FBI took a lot of heat for that. There was a lot of pushback, a lot of blowback, a lot of controversy about their methods, about the reverse sting. You know, a lot of people on the juries of Albanese's trials. Albanese had 2 trials related to this case, a state trial and a federal trial. And the jury in both cases believed him to be guilty, but they also expressed some concern and admonishment towards the FBI and the methods used in this case.
Yeah, I can only imagine that just common people are going to go blame the FBI for the death of Joe Riley.
You know, certainly Joe's friends and a lot of Joe's friends and family did indeed blame the FBI. Joe's own mother did not blame Michael Albanese for putting Joe up to this, for encouraging Joe to do what he did. He blamed the FBI for setting this up. She stood beside Michael Albanese's mother during Albanese's trial. And, you know, I think that sentiment still exists to this day. I think that there's people in Kansas City and beyond who still blame the FBI for what happened. The reader will have to decide for themselves. Again, I've tried to remain very neutral and offer perspectives from both sides. So if you get the book, you can decide for yourself if you think that the FBI, you know, bears some blame in this.
How much did Nick LaFranca have to do with the sting?
Well, Nick LaFranca was right there with Michael Albanese in that same car. And yet he was not charged with felony murder. There was certainly enough probable cause to charge him with felony murder, but he was not. Largely because he did turn state's witness and he did become a rat in the parlance of the streets, or in the parlance of, say, Oscar Goodman. You know, and so he got a pretty sweet deal. He got a very lenient sentence, which included not being charged with felony murder, which put Albanese away for 25 and a half years. Albanese never did turn on anybody else. He had the opportunity later once he was already convicted, but he turned that down, and in a very old school type of way, did his full sentence without opening his mouth or, you know, giving out any information on some of the other young Italians or other people that Albanese knew who, you know, law enforcement would have liked to have made cases against.
Did Oscar Goodman come into play in this case at all?
So I think that is a very interesting element of this story, especially for folks in Las Vegas. You know, Oscar Goodman had a long history in Kansas City. He represented Nick and Carl Sevilla back in the 60s, 70s, and on up into the 80s. He represented Tony Sevilla. He was at the strawman trials in Kansas City. So Oscar Goodman had pretty close associations with some of these important gangsters in Kansas City. But then later in this story, Oscar Goodman represented Jim Whining, who was Travis Riley's very close associate. Jim Whining had taken Mutual of Omaha for $236 million. And Oscar Goodman represented Jim Whining in Kansas City at this time. Now, here's the biggest takeaway here. Jim Whining was a rat. Now, I know that Oscar Goodman, part of his brand was that he did not represent rats.
Right.
The only good rat was a dead rat, according to Oscar Goodman. Now, I really admire Oscar Goodman in many ways. I've read everything I can about the guy. I've read his biography. I think there's a lot to admire about Oscar Goodman in many ways in terms of being a truly independent political figure who's really not beholden to either party. I think that's rare and refreshing. As far as I know, he's still popular in Vegas for having, done a lot of things that benefited Las Vegas. He's a fun guy. He's a colorful guy. But in this case, I think that there's maybe a little hypocrisy there because I know that Oscar Goodman did, in fact, represent a rat named Jim Whining in Kansas City. He got him a good. I'll say this for him: he got him a good deal, very good deal. Jim Whining was found guilty, but he got probation on a $236 million fraud.
Wow.
So, but again, I don't think that sweetheart sentence would have happened without the fact that he was a rat and he helped bring down Travis Riley. So just an interesting twist to the story that involved. You can't really, whenever you talk about organized crime in Kansas City, it always leads to Las Vegas at some point, right? Whether it's back in the 60s or 70s or 80s or the straw man and the skimming, or even in this story with this kind of heretofore unknown and obscure element of Oscar Goodman's career.
On Oscar Goodman, completely unrelated to this case, do you know anything about the story of how Oscar Goodman had a role in saving Lefty Rosenthal's life?
Yeah, that's an interesting story too. And I get into that a little bit in the book. And again, it comes back to Kansas City where agents had they had wiretapped a phone in Nick Savilla's lawyer's office. And Nick Savilla was the godfather in Kansas City for many years, very powerful on the national scene with the Teamsters Union and beyond. But Savilla was talking to Lefty Rosenthal in Vegas. And wait a minute. No, I'm sorry. He was talking to Oscar Goodman on the phone. They were talking about Lefty Rosenthal.
Okay.
And Savilla asked Goodman, is he crazy? Meaning, is Lefty crazy? Goodman said, no, I don't think he's crazy. Well, the FBI in court testified that was a code conversation, that crazy was code word for, is he talking? Is he loose-lipped? Is he someone who might need to be eliminated? And so when Goodman said, no, I don't think Lefty's crazy, that according to the FBI at the time anyway, that saved Lefty's life. Otherwise, Savilla would have moved in and taken steps to had Lefty killed, which we know happened later anyway with the car bombing, et cetera, in Las Vegas. But Goodman laughs that off and said he didn't know it at the time, but apparently he saved Lefty Rosenthal's life. So I think Goodman sort of gets a chuckle out of that whole story. But maybe the FBI was just, really reaching, try to paint the picture as such. But then I'm sure there's folks out there who believe the FBI on that, think that, that Goodman was indeed a lot closer, was a counselor, more of a consigliere than a counselor in a lawyerly sense. Or that perception still is also.
From writing this book, Frank, what did you learn about this story that you may not have known going into it?
I really didn't know too much going into it. I think what I learned is that it's a fascinating story, that it gets into all kinds of interesting and surprising connections, including international crime. I thought it was very much just a local Kansas City thing, but it turns out it was international in scope with the insurance fraud. It turns out there's interesting, well-known, nationally recognized people like Oscar Goodman, like Claire McCaskill. Interesting stories about people like that people recognize all over the country. So I think that the connections and the tentacles radiating from Kansas City to other places is what surprised me the most.
I'm going to put links in the show notes where listeners can click and buy the book, but go ahead and tell them from yourself where else they can get it.
Thanks, Tommy. But before I do that, I just want to say one thing, which is that, you know, in my previous book, the Mafia and the Machine, the story of the Kansas City mob, one of my sources in that book was Dan Moldea.
Oh.
And I listened to your podcast with him, and I just was blown away with it. And I thought that was the best summary of the Hoffa disappearance that anybody could find anywhere. So if anybody wants an authoritative summary of the Jimmy Hoffa disappearance, go to Before the Lights and check out that podcast, because it was just outstanding.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Well, yeah, it's true. Just really incredible stuff. But now I have to remember your question.
Where can they get your book?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and the book is available at store.bookbaby.com. If you're an independent author like me, BookBaby is a great way to keep a larger percentage of your royalties than you would get from a traditional publisher. So store.bookbaby.com. That would be wonderful if you could purchase it there. It will also be available on Amazon on July 8th, forevermore from that point forward. So, you know, if it's just easier for you to do that, please, by all means, do so. But BookBaby would be preferred. So that's that. And hopefully it'll end up in some stores. I hope that there'll be some interest in Las Vegas also.
Yes, and I'm going to put a link to the BookBaby link so you guys can get it right there. And I'll also put a link to the Dan Moldea show that I did about the Hoffa disappearance. You can click that as well. Frank, thanks so much for coming on the show, man, and talking about this story. It's really a good story.
Well, Tommy, I really appreciate it. I love your show. I'm honored to be one of your guests, because the list of guests you've had is just so impressive, and you run such a great show. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate the kind comments. Listeners, get the extra 5 interviews. They're yours to have. I no longer do them. They're available starting at just $2.99. They're in 6 categories of food and beverage, entertainment, actors, music, crime, and sports. Go to the show notes or go to beforethelightspod.com/shop. That's going to do it for this episode of Before the Lights. I'm Tommy Kennelly. And until next time, everybody, a salute, a chin chin.